This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Verso Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is Without Apology, The Abortion Struggle Now by Jenny Brown. With an anti-abortion majority on the Supreme Court and several states attempting to outlaw abortion altogether, many activists are on the defensive, hoping to hold on to reproductive rights in a few places and cases. This spirited book shows how feminism can start winning again. Jenny Brown uncovers a century of legal abortion in the United States until 1873, recalls women's experiences in the illegal days, and shows how the women's liberation movement of the 1960s really won abortion rights. She draws inspiration and lessons from the radicals of the Red Stockings, the Army of Three, and the Jane Collective, putting together a roadmap for today's organizers from the Black feminist argument for reproductive justice, the successful fight to make the morning after pill available over the counter, and the recent mass movement to repeal Ireland's abortion ban. Brown argues that politically conservative nonprofits have been setting the agenda, emphasizing rare tragic cases and relying on the rhetoric of choice and privacy. Instead, it is time to return to the fundamental ideas that won legal abortion in the first place. Women publicly telling the full truth of their own experience, demanding repeal of all abortion restrictions, and showing how abortion and birth control are key demands in the struggle for women's liberation. Without Apology, The Abortion Struggle Now by Jenny Brown, out now from Verso Books. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. Ayn Rand. I've never read more than a few sentences of a single text that she wrote. Yet her work and personality have come to define the politics and economics, and even more so, the mood of the world we live in today. You shouldn't have to read Rand either. She is, however, so consequential. So what to do? Fortunately, my guest today is Lisa Duggan, and she has written a really smart, engaging, and mercifully short book explaining everything that you or I or anyone really needs to know about Rand, Mean Girl, Ayn Rand, and the culture of greed. It's great news because instead of suffering through Rand's work in an attempt to grasp at how it somehow became so important, you can instead enjoy Lisa's wonderful book. Truly, there are not enough good short books like this that operate as an extended essay of sorts. Anyhow, before we get started, I'm pausing to ask for your support at patreon.com/thedig. I have boxes and boxes full of left-wing books, perfect for Dig listeners like you, to give away as a thank you. But what's most important for me to express to you is that this podcast is a completely financially independent operation. And aside from a small amount of advertising revenue, we are dependent on you to make this my full-time job, to pay my producer, our communications coordinators for music, web hosting, shipping, and all sorts of other things. Plus, I get an email notification every time someone new donates. It reminds me that you're out there listening and appreciate what we're doing. And I appreciate that immensely. That's patreon.com/thedig. Thank you. And here's Lisa Duggan, a historian, journalist, and activist who teaches at NYU. She is the author of several books, including Twilight of Equality, Neoliberalism, Cultural Politics, and the Attack on Democracy, Sex Wars, Sexual Dissent, and Political Culture, and Mean Girl, Ayn Rand and the Culture of Greed, out now from University of California Press. Lisa Duggan, welcome back to The Dig.
So glad to be here.
You write that what ties all of Ayn Rand together and what ties Rand to the core of today's political economy is a mood, which goes some way to explaining why Rand's ideas are so popular, because it's not really about her ideas. You write, quote, "The unifying threads are meanness and greed, and the spirit of the whole hodgepodge is Ayn Rand." To start, explain your argument as to why Rand operates most powerfully on an affective register, how that functions to legitimate and reproduce the dominant order, and also, as an aside, what affects and moods are for listeners who don't know.
Sure. Well, I'll start out just by saying that, say, in my business, American Studies, when people write about empire and colonialism, they also they include in that writing about desire, fantasy, libido. They write about race, gender, sexuality, and intimacy. So if you read the stuff on empire or colonialism, you'll find that people aren't treating it as a rational system based in institutions solely. They're dealing with fantasy and desire. But most people who write about neoliberalism are social scientists who don't write about fantasy, desire, and libido. But it seemed to me that neoliberalism is actually rife with that, and that is one of the ways people are recruited to consent for really brutal neoliberal policies, is they're recruited through their feelings and their fantasies often. And this happens in the case of Ayn Rand. Most people encounter Ayn Rand in high school. So they read these two big novels, right? Have you read either one of them?
No.
Did you read them in high school? No?
I was already a commie in high school.
Okay. So was I. I also didn't read her in high school. But so most people do, though, encounter her initially in high school. And the novels are a kind of conversion machine. So many people who go on to a wide range of different kinds of right-wing and pro-capitalist politics start out by being fans of Ayn Rand. And then they encounter Milton Friedman or the International Monetary Fund or the Cato Institute or the Koch brothers later. But they're sort of set up through the fantasies of heroic, sexy, entrepreneurial supremacy
She's a gateway drug.
In Ayn Rand, yes, it's like it's a drug. It's filled with a sense of like aspiration to superiority and a sense of me against the world that appeals to adolescents a lot. So it's a big machine for converting adolescents to a set of feelings and fantasies that then fold into conservative, right-wing, and pro-capitalist politics. So, though Ayn Rand herself is no neoliberal, she was formed in the early to mid-20th century. She started out as a Russian immigrant who was anti-Bolshevik. That was her primary formation herself, was through her opposition to the Bolsheviks, and she became an expat and came to the United States. But at the core of that was anti-solidarity. So she used the term collectivism, but what she was really opposed to was the solidarity of the losers and the moochers. And she saw, when people who are inferior band together, they ruin the world. And so the affect that goes with that is contempt, derision, kind of superiority, a kind of cruelty that is formative from her early on. And then it carries through the whole 20th century, where she becomes anti-New Deal, because of the compassion problem of the New Deal. She becomes anti-communist. But the thread through all of it, she didn't actually understand capitalism, and we can talk about that later. So her ideas about capitalism were actually really, distorted and fantastic. But the thread that follows through is the affect, the feeling of anti-solidarity and contempt, derision, and superiority. So
it wasn't, just to pause you for a second, it wasn't just that she opposed solidarity, but even opposed caring about others, because that, like, just on a most basic, like an anti-morality, because that would inevitably lead to solidarity, or was
right.
solidarity
And in
itself.
fact, maybe I'm piling that into the word solidarity, right, as opposed to collectivism, as it involving a feeling. So solidarity isn't just an alliance, it's a feeling, right? So you feel solidarity with others. It's a way of identifying in and through other people and their struggles. So it isn't just an aligned set of interests, as it is a kind of feeling too. I mean, I would say solidarity is a feeling, right? So when you watch the teacher strikes, the recent teacher strikes, and you get all choked up from watching them, the feeling that one has, I would call that solidarity, right? So she's the anti-solidarity, right? She's the like contempt and derision for that feeling, and instead identifying with the feeling of derision, contempt, and superiority. And so what makes her then, though she was not herself a neoliberal because her formation is too early, she becomes an icon of neoliberalism. Especially after 2008, but even before then, because of the affect of neoliberalism, because neoliberalism formed, as it was formed in, say, Western welfare states, it was formed as a kind of rejection of the New Deal, and not just the policies of the New Deal, but the affective underpinnings of the New Deal, right? The sympathy with others, right? Solidarity with the poor, with working people, across color lines, right? She produced a set of affects that reject the affective rejection of the New Deal that became at the heart of neoliberalism. So neoliberalism, the kind of, we don't care about children in cages, we don't care about losers and moochers, we don't care what, the feeling center at the heart of the policies, she's one of the primary suppliers of that, right? One of the sources of that for people who read her, become fans of her, or just maybe they never read her, but she becomes a reference point across the conservative political spectrum. All different kinds of conservatives and right-wingers reference her as an influence, even when they haven't actually read her.
You take Lauren Berlant's concept of cruel optimism, which refers to the set of feelings necessary to keep hustling against the odds. And you remake it to define Rand's register as one of optimistic cruelty.
I reversed that.
Explain these two concepts and how the two functionally and sort of simultaneously, I think, relate to one another in American life today.
Yeah, I mean, Lauren Berlant's book, which is titled Cruel Optimism, is really a very brilliant excavation of what it takes to keep going in the face of all of the losses and depredations of the loss of the social safety net and the loss of decent jobs, all the losses of neoliberal policy. People endure them by investing in some version of the good life, even when they can see that it's being cut out from under them. So you still apply to grad school, you still go on the job market, even when you can see no one's getting jobs. You get your precarious jobs with the belief that you're eventually going to get some security, it's going to get better. And so she is a really brilliant, careful excavator of those traces of feeling that keep people going, even when the odds are all against them and the evidence is all against them. So they retain this sort of cruelty of optimism in the face of an actual lack of flourishing, right?
An optimism that's cruel to them.
To them. The optimism is cruel to the person who embraces it, who works to remain optimistic in the face of an actual failure to flourish. That is the result of policy. So she's writing about the 99%, right? She's writing about the ordinary people and how they keep going. Well, I wanted to really talk about how people come to identify with the 1%, even if they're not in the 1%, right? The way that set of identifications works so that people's aspirations align with Donald Trump, even when their lives do not. So I use the term optimistic cruelty, and specifically applying that to the way Ayn Rand's ideas work, because it's sort of the ideas that fuel the rise of capitalism in the United States are that these forms of cruelty, right, these hierarchies, these brutalities will lead to the best life ultimately for everyone. Like, the entrepreneurs will make jobs, and even though people won't make very much money, they don't really deserve and can't really appreciate more than that. And that we'll get the best world possible if we have brutal, raw, competitive, unregulated capitalism. That's really the best possible world for everyone. And that's the premise of Atlas Shrugged, is that when the New Deal erodes that kind of raw capitalism, the world disintegrates and collapses, and the entrepreneurs have to escape to their little utopia, and we would see it as dystopian Galt's Gulch, in order to escape the world that's collapsing, and it's collapsing in the face of the erosion of raw capitalism. So that's optimistic cruelty, the identification with that optimism about cruelty. Though in this political moment, I wouldn't call it optimistic cruelty anymore. It's really much grimmer and darker vision that advocates of Ayn Rand have today, whether they're in the Trump administration or whether they're in Silicon Valley. It's a much grimmer, darker view. I was reading an essay on Patreon recently by Richard Seymour, and it was about the death drive of capitalism, right? And about climate denial as being the capitalism's death drive. As in, no longer are they investing in this vision of ultimate good and triumph. They're actually just right to the death, going to take everything while it burns to the ground. So I'd say in the present, I wouldn't call it optimistic cruelty anymore. I would use that to talk about the 20th century layering in of Ayn Rand's feelings as they applied to the rise and the triumph of a certain kind of capitalism.
You write that Rand's work, quote, creates a moral economy of inequality to infuse her softly pornographic romance fiction with the political eros that would captivate a mass readership. And another line along these lines, quote, the Fountainhead offered simultaneously eroticized and moralized character studies embedded in a heroic romance plot for the purpose of generating desire for capitalism. And another great line along these lines, quote, Ayn Rand made acquisitive capitalists sexy. She launched thousands of teenage libidos into the world of reactionary politics on a wave of quivering excitement. How does Rand's work use the erotic structure of her characters' interpersonal relationships as a vehicle for the eroticization of capitalism?
Yeah, that's kind of key to the impact she has, because it really is the kind of erotic force of her novels that it works as the conversion machine. Well, she started out as a child in St. Petersburg reading imperial children's fiction. So she identified with, say, British captains in India who showed their superiority over the savage Hindu masses and so forth. And she had a kind of erotic thrill as a child in these characters, and she wrote about them in her journals and so forth. These characters from British and German children's fiction. Her fantasies about them was that their superiority, their imperial superiority, these very Aryan characters who were physically perfect, who were dominant over the lower orders, who were contemptuous, that was, to her, that was sexiness. So she produced a kind of, in this case, masculine. She had a feminine version of it too, but she had a masculine sexiness that she just quivered to. And in writing her masculine characters, she eroticized these qualities. So she's not doing it wholesale. She's not making it up. She's drawing, this I think is key to her popularity because she was massively popular. She's drawing on deep threads of civilizational discourse. So people read it and they recognize recognize the way that a kind of civilizational domination, the way that domination has been eroticized as part of the project of empire, right? So she draws on that, and then she creates these stories built on this eroticized civilizational discourse that's written into characters in romance plots. And there's always a little soft BDSM going on. She scandalizes readers a little bit with the soft BDSM points in these plots where the characters are eroticized. So the female characters are eroticized in a parallel way. She's a kind of Ann Coulter feminist in that she thinks of men and women are equal as long as they're gender. There's an extreme gender binary, and women are glamorous and men are manly, and women can be equal to men in everything. Her female hero in Atlas Shrugged runs a railroad, except sex, where they are power bottoms. So the women are all femme power bottoms, and so their power is really derived from, they have a power in the world that's based in their glamorous femme sexiness, which is tied to their whiteness, their slenderness, their Aryan, their good looks. They're all blonde. And the only place where they prove their femininity is by submitting to a hero, their male hero. So that romance plot and that binary gender and that kind of equality of binary opposites is really a key thread where teenagers read this work, and they often find exactly the points of sexiness that they then identify aspirationally with these heroic characters as the people that, well, I will be the exceptional creative figure who breaks out from the mediocre, and there's a set of identifications that attach, and that will make me sexy. Everyone will be lusting after me for my entrepreneurial sexiness. You can see that in the way that, say, Silicon Valley tech moguls, who maybe were nerds in high school, and invent themselves into Ayn Rand heroes. Donald Trump thinks he's an Ayn Rand hero. He imagines himself to be Howard Rourke, the red-headed architect in The Fountainhead. He's, in fact, an Ayn Rand villain. He's a crony capitalist with not an Aryan body of the sort she thought was powerful and sexy, and she would have made hideous fun of him. But he understands himself he eroticizes his own being in the world. There's a libidinal investment in the way he imagines himself that's partly in and through an Ayn Rand character.
Given that she thought she was the smartest person who ever lived, why was it so impossible for her to portray a female hero to whom men ultimately submit?
Because that would have violated her fundamental commitment to a gendered binary, right? So her fundamental commitment in the end was that this is not in her life, right? This is in her work and in her novels and in her imaginings. Femininity itself is defined by submission. And then she tries to get around that by saying, well, it only has to be in this one place, the bedroom, and then it doesn't have to be anywhere else. And that's her workaround. In her actual life, though, it was very different. She basically cast her husband. She met him on a film lot in Hollywood, and incredibly handsome guy who looks like her kind of Aryan hero, right? Chiseled face, tall, blonde, slender, beautiful man.
But he was like a wallflower.
He was a florist. He loved peacocks. He dressed beautifully. He was very passive. He did everything she told him to. He sat around and looked glamorous. He was basically almost her butler, and then he died of alcoholism. But she always introduced him as her hero, right? This is my masculine Ayn Rand hero because he looked like one. But he had none of the other characteristics that she ascribed. So her life and her work were full of contradictions.
He looked the part, which sounds very familiar to our current president, who reportedly chooses cabinet members and whatnot based on whether they look the part.
That's what she did, Right. That's what she did. Her life and work are full of like incredible contradictions. So here she is, the ultimate rationalist who had a complete mental breakdown when she found out her boyfriend was cheating on her. She's the ultimate individualist who is the head of a cult where everyone has to follow and believe everything that she says. Right. So her life and even her work itself is just rife with contradiction.
And she was a Benzedrine addict.
Pardon? Yes, she was a Benzedrine addict. That's how she wrote Atlas Shrugged. It took her 13 years. She did it mostly on Benzedrine. And after she went off Benzedrine, when she finished Atlas Shrugged and she fell into a major, major depression that she pretty much never really recovered from. Her Benzedrine depression, which was followed by the tragic affair and the consequences of that. And she never really recovered from that.
Was she a prisoner of her own cruel optimism?
No, she was. I really resist diagnosing her because when we diagnose someone, sometimes that we then remove them from the cultural context and say this person is an exceptional person because they have a diagnosis and so they're not representative of their culture. And she is so deeply embedded in our cultural context and drawing so deeply from the discourses and narratives that are at the core of the culture that we live in that I don't want to single her out by diagnosing her. But when we start talking about her as an individual, it's a little hard to completely evade the fact that she had the characteristics of a malignant narcissist. Right? So she undermined herself at every turn with rage, with narcissistic rage. Every time things did not go exactly as she wanted them to go and people didn't respond exactly as she wanted them to respond, she melted down. So
that also sounds familiar.
Yeah, it is very, very Trumpian, right?
It's really weird how resonant it all is.
Yeah, the malignant narcissism. And, the whole thing about the storm was going to Alabama can't be wrong, can't be wrong.
And the Sharpie marker.
Yeah, that's just really, you can't make it up. It's so ridiculous. But that's what she was like. So her vision for herself began in this optimistic arc where she thought she was a genius and she believed she'd go to Hollywood and she'd really make it there. But in fact, she didn't understand Hollywood or how Hollywood worked. And so she got driven out of Hollywood. She went to Washington. She tried to be part of the anti-communist program there in the McCarthy era. She misunderstood that. She misgauged that. They didn't even invite her back for a second day of testimony before the House Un-Americans Activities Committee. She went to New York. And she was, rude and demanding and alienated everyone. And by the end of her life, she was depressed and alone. And she died of lung cancer. She had been a smoker all her life who always denied that smoking had any connection with lung cancer. And she asserted that unto her death of lung cancer, pretty much alone. She began that arc, not unlike the whole 20th into 21st century trajectory of capitalism. She started out optimistic about the future of herself and of capitalism. And by the time she died, which was in 1982, so right at the beginning of the state project of neoliberalism, she was grim and depressed and no longer optimistic about anything. She was in a constant rage at the time of her death.
Rand's first English language novel, which was never completed, depicted a hero based upon a Los Angeles multiple murderer named William Hickman, who, amongst other things, kidnapped, murdered, and dismembered a 12-year-old girl in the most horrifically gruesome way imaginable. Rand was impressed by Hickman's demeanor and personality.
She had a crush on him.
Which Hickman summed up in his own defense as, quote, "I am like the state. What is good for me is right."
He said that at his trial. Yes.
Gore Vidal wrote in 1961, quote, "Ayn Rand's philosophy is nearly perfect in its immorality, which makes the size of her audience all the more ominous and symptomatic as we enter a curious new phase in our society. Moral values are in flux. The muddy depths are being stirred by new monsters and witches from the deep. Trolls walk the American night.
Yeah, that's prescient, isn't it?
Caesars are stirring in the Forum. There are storm warnings ahead." Is Rand or was Rand distinctive amongst right-wing ideologues in her naked and explicit anti-morality, or was, as you suggested, was she just prescient?
Well,
Like Orville.
she did something that was not at all unusual, but she did it to extremes, right? So she reversed the terms of conventional religious morality, and she also appropriated and reworked the assumptions, logics, concepts, and slogans of the left. Right. So with the religious morality, she came to argue that altruism and compassion were immoral, that they were immoral because they encouraged the weak and the incompetent to have more power than they should and have more resources than they should, and then they would mess it up for all of us. And that it was moral to be selfish and greedy, like, the film Wall Street, greed is good. Remember that slogan? She was saying that, right, in the early 20th century, that was a moral virtue, that greed and selfishness were a moral virtue. So she's not the only one who was saying that, but she was embedded in a little field of right-wingers. During the early 20th century, they were kind of an extreme of the right wing, and then they were, sidelined all up until neoliberalism, when that becomes a more centrally mainstream argument, and her popularity rises as a result. But so the other thing she does is she usurps and reverses ideas about the left, so that the producers produce all value, right? It's the producer's theory of value rather than the title of Atlas Shrugged. Its original title was The Strike,
Because it's a capital strike.
Right, because it's the capitalists who go on strike. The capitalists go on strike and the world collapses. Her first nonfiction manifesto was called Individualists of the World Unite. Right. So she was always taking left-wing ideas and turning them on their head. And she also took religious ideals and religious morality and reversed the terms of those as well. But she wasn't alone in that. She was just particularly extreme in doing it.
This is a good moment to pause and explain objectivism, or attempt to.
Yeah.
She succinctly explained it like so. Quote, 1, metaphysics, objective reality. 2, epistemology, reason. 3, ethics, self-interest. 4, politics, capitalism. It seems as though...
That's the whole thing. You don't need to know anymore.
What does that mean? And what is she drawing on? Because there's no evidence that you write deeply or widely.
No, she read in a very superficial way. She joined a reading group that was organized by Isabel Patterson, who was another right-wing writer, journalist. And through Isabel Patterson, she read a bunch of sort of secondary right-wing literature. She could reference the primary right-wing literature. I mean, she could reference Hayek, right? But she didn't actually read most of these texts in any depth at all. And she fundamentally didn't understand capitalism, though she is often sort of touted as being the most important proponent of capitalism, and people become fans of hers and then go on to adopt her view of capitalism. But for instance, when she was in Hollywood, her big critique of Cecil B. DeMille was that he was a box office chaser.
Which is just
that's kind of definitional for what a capitalist is. And if you look at the Fountainhead, for folks who've read The Fountainhead, it's about, this architect who sticks to his own vision while he's being taken down by, interfered with by to other mediocre architects, by pandering newspapers, by collectivist bureaucrats, by businessmen who only care about the bottom line, and here's the heroic architect. So that was her vision of herself in Hollywood, right? That she was the creative intellectual, and then all of these studio executives and directors and the business of Hollywood, the box office chasing, made it impossible for her to be the star writer, script writer that she wanted to be. But that's she doesn't understand capitalism, and capitalism is a collectivist and corporate enterprise. It's a class project. She didn't understand that. So she was always promoting this kind of fantasy that capitalism was composed. This is what appeals particularly to Silicon Valley techs. She saw capitalism as being run, the motor of capitalism being brilliant, superior individuals doing what they individually do best, unmolested by all the mediocre people who might get in their way. And that is her definition of capitalism. And so she tripped over that many times because she got driven out of Hollywood. She misunderstood the dynamics of capitalism. So in the end, she never self-criticized. She never came to understand that her view of capitalism was incorrect. She just thought everybody was doing capitalism wrong. Right? So all these morons are doing capitalism wrong by treating it as a class project and a collaboration between the state and capitalists, that they shouldn't be doing that. That's the wrong way to do capitalism, rather than recognizing that that is definitional to the history of capitalism.
Which relates to this core conflict you identify in Rand's work between whether kind of her heroes are victorious conquerors or outsiders,
yes,
marginalized for being great. How does this arrogant valorization of the ruling class function alongside this deep sense of resentment, this grievance over great people, the naturally great, wrongly being denied their place as rulers?
You know, this is especially interesting about her, and it's what makes her, I think, the breakout kind of icon that she became, is that she's not only giving readers the complacent view of the superiority of European civilization and white supremacy and capitalism. She is doing that, but she's not only doing that. Her experience both as a Jewish person in Russia and as a woman meant that she really was excluded from and not able to do many of the things she thought she deserved. And she was bitterly angry about the fact that she was, although she, had many anti-Semitic tropes, her view of femininity required submission in the end, but she also was very bitterly angry about not being accepted into the easy, complacent kind of elite, capitalist and intellectual elite that she wanted to be accepted into. People patronized her and dismissed her, both because she was Jewish and because she was Russian Jew, immigrant, and because she was a woman. So her fiction and her thinking is this combination of advocacy of this kind of these deep hierarchies of Western civilization, and also a kind of anger about outsiderness. And that her plots are and her characters are touched by that, so that there are points of identification for people who feel like outsiders. For instance, she has a rather huge queer following. And I mean, it's not just the right wing, like the Cato Institute, the guys at the Cato Institute. She definitely has those. Peter Thiel, right? So that kind of gay fan. But she has a lot of queers and who write fan fiction. There's an article in this month's Gay and Lesbian Review that is tracing the homoerotic themes in The Fountainhead, without actually referring to the rest of the context of the Fountainhead. That's fairly common, and it's because her characters, their marriage is really only represented as something that ties you down, even though she herself was married. She married for citizenship. There are no children. People rail against the limitations of the family, the way they're held back by the family, by the state, by the church. They're trying to break free. And a lot of queer teenagers really resonate with that, right? It's like, look, the family, the church, and the state, they won't let me be myself. And so here are these points of identification that show how a creative individual can break free. So she has a fairly large queer following, including among progressives, who just ignore the rest of the context of the book. For instance, Ivan van Hove, who's a Belgian social democratic gay playwright, very highly regarded, did a production of The Fountainhead at BAM last year. It was very well reviewed. It was full of the cultural elite of Manhattan, and it was uncritical. It was very well done.
It was a faithful
dramatization of the Fountainhead. He was interviewed about it, and he said someone gave him a copy of the Fountainhead, and he loved it. He loved it. He loved it so much he knew he had to stage it, and it was because of his. This is the struggle of the creative individual, right? To create what you vision against all the interference of people who want to take you down, right? So he resonated to that. The fact that everybody's sitting there in this theater and on the stage, I mean, what happens in the end is Howard Rourke blows up a public housing project because it isn't built according to his specifications, and everyone is supposed to cheer.
Yeah, this is not compassionate conservatism.
No, no, and these are progressives. This
right-wing terrorism.
These are New York anti-Trump liberals, right? And European Social Democrat, who's the author of it, because they're ignoring the context. And the best way I can explain that, I actually went around and talked to people outside the production. I went a couple of times, is that they just ignore the context because it's so deeply familiar, right? It's culturally familiar. They don't even register the brutality, the cruelty, the inequality, the racism. They don't even register it while they're looking at the kind of romance plot and the individual creative achievement plot, and they're not registering the larger context. So I think that is, in a sense, the problem of liberalism per se, right?
Yeah, because does that also reflect their own kind of class position and the self-regard that they have in terms of their own position as creative professionals and the unacknowledged violence of that?
Exactly. And it's the problem with liberalism per se, even when it's advocated by people who are not themselves elite, there's like this dropping away of the political economic context to focus on one particular kind of struggle and not looking at, one struggle for inclusion or one kind of struggle for success without looking at the broader context. So Ayn Rand facilitates those kinds of identifications from a range of outsiders, partly because she was on a couple of fronts an outsider herself. So she's angry about that. And though she doesn't thematize that anger and outsiderness, it just finds its affective way into her plots and her characters so that it's easier for outsiders to resonate to it and then not really register the brutality of the larger context. So one of the reasons that I wrote this book, many reasons, but one of them was to make that impossible or less possible, right, for anyone to not see what the broad context is for this popularity of her fiction.
This contradiction between the celebration of elitism and outsider grievance once again feels very Trumpian.
Yeah.
This idea that kind of leaders are the natural winners, but also the best people are winners who've been wronged by losers, denying the natural winners their natural right to lead and truly win.
So in its expressive heart, that's what it is. But there's also room in there for, say, centrist Democrats, right, who feel like they don't have a critique of the system except they've been excluded because they're women, or they've been excluded because they're gay, or they've been excluded because they're – so there's room for that too, right? So there are people who are not conservatives, who are social democrats, right, who also – find a way into that universe and then end up accepting the capitalism civilizational discourse as the context within which they're looking for their place. So it's available even outside, like the Trumpian version of it.
Given the mid-20th century capitalism that fell so short of the capitalism she believed in, did she in some ways anticipate capitalism's broader ability to absorb and redeploy the aesthetic critique of gray managerial, bureaucratic mid-century capitalism?
She was such a black and white thinker that she could only understand capitalism as being corrupted by those incorporations, right? So she saw capitalism as failing and being corrupted by its managerialism, by its collaborations with the state, by but in order to see capitalism as corrupted, she also had to have a fantasy version of the history of capitalism, because of course capitalism has never been independent of the state, right? The creation of the very context of of markets and the set of relations that allow capitalism to function have always been embedded in the state. There's the idea that there's a laissez-faire, right, version of capitalism that's without the state is a complete malarkey. And most of the actual neoliberals knew that. Right, so they had a rhetoric of laissez-faire, but themselves they knew what they needed to do was restructure markets and states, not eliminate them. Though their public rhetoric was like, be free of the state, right? But Ayn Rand was just like, she just was like, be free of the state. She had no capacity, knowledge to really understand how markets and economies and states actually operated.
She couldn't do the technocratic work of libertarianism, let alone neoliberalism.
Yeah, exactly. And she hated libertarians, which is also, she called them right-wing hippies.
I want to get to that. There's some great lines on that.
Yeah.
So, the state and its foundational role is absent in Rand's work, and productive labor as value producing, of course, is nowhere to be seen.
Yeah.
Reproductive labor is also
nowhere to be seen.
Nowhere. In Anthem, a female character becomes pregnant, but her later work
there are no pregnancies, there are no children.
No pregnancies, just, quote, intensely eroticized romantic triangles.
Yeah.
In The Fountainhead, maternity is demonized with this character who's disparaged in it, Peter Keating. His weakness is conveyed by the fact that he loves his mother.
Yes.
Which is just supposed to be prima facie obvious.
She's profoundly anti-maternal.
And then other women are portrayed as nagging parasites or starving primitives and incompetent. And then in Atlas Shrugged, as you've mentioned a few times, when the capitalists go on strike, they go to this place called the Gulch, which is, you write, quote, free of detectable labor exploitation and nearly free of any trace of reproductive labor or family life. How does Rand render labor's creation of value invisible in her microcosmic utopia? And two, what is the relationship between her invisibilization of productive labor and her invisibilization of reproductive labor?
She glorifies, right, the entrepreneur, the capitalist, and she sees the sort of the idea and the creation all belonging to the entrepreneur. So the productive labor, the people who build the building, who make the plans that the brilliant architect invents, they're really not much different than kind of oxes to her, right? They're people who perform the labor in a relatively mechanical way that has been set out by the brilliant individual superior entrepreneur. So it's invisibilized as productive and creative. It's just kind of brute, uncreative, non-brain involved. In her novel, We the Living, which is her only novel based in Russia, right? And it's based during the revolution in Russia. She has a section where she describes peasant life in Russia, and it is so brutally demeaning, right, of these sort of stupid, brutal peasants and the stupid brutality of peasant life. And that's her view of workers as well. She just doesn't, there's nowhere in her writing where she's as explicit about that as she is about the peasants, the peasantry in Russia. So
and they're almost like racialized as genetic inferiors.
And so reproductive labor is similarly brute, animal. It's like growing a plant, right? You're no different than the soil, right? So she doesn't see reproduction as creative or productive labor. She just sees it as like a brute, bare life, kind of thing. And then because she saw her escape from Russia as being an escape from the state, the family, and the church, these are aligned to her. So she sees them all as the site of a kind of negative solidarity, right? The family will keep you down, the state will keep you down, the church will keep you down, and the only way to achieve is to escape them. So they're very closely aligned. So the nanny state is very much like the wife, right? You have a nanny state, you have a wife, they do servile labor, they like also nag and try to control you. So the regulated managerial state is also aligned with like the wife. So wives are terrible in her fiction. Their wives are all horrifying, nagging, controlling harridans, and all the sexy women are all mistresses. Right. So it's without children, mostly without husbands, or their husbands are serially discarded. And the men also, if they have families, the families have a totally destructive impact on them. And I think that's one of the openings for a certain kind of queer identification, right, is the feeling of like wanting to escape the family, the church and the state. But in her rendering of it, it's not, she's not producing a queer liberation politics out of that, I say with so much understatement. It's really just the way for her, women are a drag. Children are a drag. And the only way a woman cannot be a drag is if she basically is a professional, Aryan, achieving co-producer. And that's her route to being a person. Other than that, she's not a person. She's a representative of the kind of brute world that brings you down. So there's tremendous misogyny in her representations, even as she produces this sort of very limited, specific kind of equivalence. I wouldn't call it equality, right? Equivalence, which still has to have a corrective moment.
Though Rand was an atheist and
Yeah.
didn't believe in the family,
Yeah.
do you think she shared something fundamentally in common with the Christian right, the Christian right's family values, in terms of the bedrock support for orders of domination that extend from the private sphere to the entirety of political economy? In other words, did Rand redeploy the basic logic of the family, but shorn of its Christian ornamentation?
Well, I wouldn't put it. I don't really see it quite that way. I think what she was deploying was the kind of a civilizational imperial model of domination, and not a familial one. She was pretty hostile to nationalism, to religion. She was anti-nationalist, so and militantly atheist, anti-family. So I wouldn't say it's the kind of logic of the Christian right. I think there are very few Ayn Rand fans in the Christian right. There are a lot of Ayn Rand fans in the alt-right. There are a lot of Ayn Rand fans, Silicon Valley, right, and libertarians. There are a lot in sort of the hybrid zombie neoliberal, faux nationalist racists in the Trump administration, but not in the real right wing. I mean, the real Christian right. Paul Ryan ran into trouble when he gave out Atlas Shrugged to every member of his staff. He required everyone to read Atlas Shrugged. But then a newspaper reporter clocked him and said, she was an atheist, right? And she also was against drug laws. And she also had an abortion, right? And he was came back the next day with, my real favorite writer is Thomas Aquinas.
Safer answer.
He switched out Ayn Rand, because there's no way to really defend Ayn Rand in the Christian right context. So there is a logic of domination, and it's built on sort of imperial, the British captain and the Hindu savages, and there is a kind of gender order of hers that is embedded in that history of civilizational empire. But I don't think it's quite equivalent to the kind of familial because there's a kind of solidaristic familialism on the Christian right, which is not her thing.
You made reference to Orientalist film and literature being very influential,
very formative for her.
Very formative. There's this French children's magazine called The Mysterious Valley, whose hero is a British infantry captain in India, and does horrible Orientalist things. In Russia, while Rand was at the State Institute for Cinematography in the 1920s, her favorite movie, and she watched a lot of them, was called The Indian Tomb, And you write, quote, "The physical descriptions, the characterizations, the thrill of conquest, the eroticization of dominant masculinity, the figures of the hero and the mob can be traced to the representation of romanticized imperialism all around her." She also once told a Native American West Point cadet, quote, "It is always going to transpire that when a superior technological culture meets up with an inferior one, the superior will prevail." But on the other hand, you write that she opposed the 1964 Civil Rights Act on the libertarian grounds of the private so-called colorblind right to contract rather than in the language of biological or civilizational racism.
She supported, but she had the same position as Barry Goldwater. Yep.
How did Rand's more eugenic and civilizational understanding of race function alongside this libertarian colorblind?
That is a great question. That's a great question because this really has to do, in part with how she Americanized her vision. So the European imperial vision is exactly from what you were reading. It's very deeply embedded in Orientalism and the vision of Orientalism and in racial domination. But of course, there is a contradiction. Is there a contradiction in all of her thinking and writing between the kind of collectivism of racial domination and her individualism? Like, how do you resolve believing in the individual and believing in white racial superiority?
And then all the great white people are in it together on the top.
Yeah, so there's a collectivism that then the individualism proceeds from, and these people down here have only collectivism and no individualism. But so she has trouble with that resolution. And that really hits her, especially when she comes to the United States, because she says she's against racism. Her claim is that she's against racism because she's for the individual and the rights of the individual. But she resolves this through a logic that actually Nancy MacLean really explains really quite well in her book, Democracy in Chains. Through what she calls property supremacism. Right? So Ayn Rand comes out against the state discrimination. So she's against state. She is against the state outlawing discrimination. She's against the state discriminating. She's against the state outlawing discrimination. She's for allowing property owners, because that's who her individuals are, to determine what they do with their property. So the fact that the property is owned by white settlers, right, who came from Europe, whose technologically superior culture wiped out the indigenous culture, that's only natural, right? And the fact that those property owners will then have the right to decide how they dispose of their property and by contract, that's according to her version of libertarianism, and that results in a consolidation of racial domination that she then resolves with individualism, her kind of merging of the property owner and the individual, right? Which is, that's the United States is built on that conflation. The individual is the property owner. So it's property supremacy, right? So it merges with the history of racial domination to produce an apparently colorblind, right, but not consolidation of racial supremacy without the use of a kind of apartheid laws, right? The apartheid laws that were predominant in the U.S. until the 1960s. So it's quite a hat trick, but it was a common hat trick on the libertarian right, and that was, in fact, Barry Goldwater's. A lot of people who said they were against racism and then opposed the Civil Rights Act.
In terms of Rand's transition from European and Russian reference points to American ones, which is a fascinating through line in your book, Rand, like Scientology, her version of Americanism was very much shaped by Hollywood, as we've discussed.
Totally it was. In St. Petersburg, that was her whole exposure.
You write, quote, "The movies outlined the cultural terms of national consolidation at the turn of the century. It was," you write, quote, "an American culture industry built by immigrants, at the top, primarily Eastern European Jewish moguls. Stridently assimilationist, these businessmen generally downplayed their past in an embrace of their new country. According to film scholars, these creative outsiders manufactured an American dream fantasy machine. a machine that idealized the United States by erasing its settler colonial origins, imperial aspirations, and stark capitalist inequalities. How did Rand coming to know the U.S. first through the mediation of this culture industry shape her politics?
That's how her understanding, her fantasy of the U.S. was built entirely on the early Hollywood movies that she went to compulsively when she was in school in St. Petersburg. So she would go to first she went to European movies. She went to some of the early Russian cinema, and then she went to Hollywood movies, and she just loved the Hollywood. She loved Hollywood movies. She loved the glamour. She loved the sparkle. So she transferred her erotic fantasy life and identifications from imperial children's fiction, European imperial children's fiction, to these Hollywood versions of gendered, eroticized, white supremacist capitalism, right? And then she came to the U.S. She went right to Hollywood, and her first job was as a script reader for Cecil B. DeMille. So she went right into the Hollywood machine, where she was so closely related. Her fantasies and the fantasies of those moguls were close, right? Like the idea that she wanted to be violently assimilationist. She chose a name. She was born Elisa Rosenbaum. She changed her name to Ayn Rand to erase her gender, her religious ethnicity, and her national origin in order to be able to be, aggressively assimilationist. Her fantasy was that she would achieve easy and immediate success, and that she would be glamorous, and that she would participate in this fantasy. And then she ran up against the ways that the fantasy that was being retailed in the movie of an idealized United States clashed not only with the actual material conditions in the United States, but it clashed with the movie business, with how the movie business was run.
As a capitalist business,
as a capitalist enterprise.
Turns out.
Right, yeah. And even though she thought she was pro-capitalist, she didn't get that what the decisions they were making that she objected to really were because of capitalism. So she transferred her vision of Europe that came from children's fiction to her vision of the United States that came from Hollywood movies, that she then wanted to step out of that directly into the world, and then she thought the world she stepped into would be substantially the same as the image. And that image was created by immigrants like herself, but as a capitalist business, in order to circulate to the widest audience within the context of the rising U.S. empire, right? This sort of vision of American success that erased all of the conditions that created that success, from settler colonialism to the exploitation of labor to the hideous treatment of immigrants to everything else. They erased themselves, right, from those films, as well as every other form of inequality and labor that subtended the world they idealized.
Yeah, just as Rand would never feature obviously Jewish hero in her book, neither would the Jewish Hollywood moguls have cast Jewish heroes in their films.
They would never have done that. They would have understood that as being a bad business decision. Right, because
and Rand, by contrast, didn't see it as a bad business decision, but as a bad ideological decision something.
And because she absorbed, anti-Semitic tropes, so that her losers and moochers often had Jewish characteristics. So they would be small, or they would wear glasses, or they would be, I'm talking about stereotypical Jewish characteristics, right? These sort of anti-Semitic tropes of the Jew. Her losers and moochers had those characteristics. So whereas her heroes had Aryan characteristics. So even though she was deeply anti-fascist, she absorbed anti-Semitism as deeply as she absorbed misogyny, even while she also tried to defend herself as a Jewish woman, which created massive contradictions in her work and her images. But that also produced novels that people identified with.
What do you make of these extremely long novels full of extremely long speeches being Rand's primary medium for philosophical expression, and that she only really dedicated herself to nonfiction writing and stopped writing fiction in the 60s and 70s?
Yeah, after her benzodine crash. So, I mean, she had the Benzedrine crash, and then Nathaniel Branden started this lecturing at the Nathaniel Branden Institute. He was born Nathan Blumenthal, changed his name to Nathaniel Branden, and he became her sidekick and eventually her boyfriend, 25 years younger. He encouraged her to turn to nonfiction writing also. So he pushed her in the direction of nonfiction writing, and it had taken 13 years to write Atlas Shrugged, and she was so burned out on the Benzedrine that she never really had it in her to write another novel. So she turned to nonfiction writing, which was never successful. I mean, people don't read her nonfiction except for her objectivist cult. So the cult, they were describe themselves as a philosophical movement who are aligned with Rand's nonfiction work. They're a very small group of people. Her nonfiction work is not particularly popular. It's the novels that are massively popular.
Because Rand loved movies and her fans loved her books that were like movies.
Yes. Though they did have, here's the part that's hard to explain, is they have these long, incredibly tedious speeches in them. And
which are just didactic, right?
Totally. And she's sharing the truth with you through the voice of one of her heroes. So she has her hero go on for 60 pages,
Subtle.
Right? And it's like just explaining the truth to you, you idiot. And when the books came out, they got terrible reviews in the newspapers and in the literary press, but they had a real word of mouth growth. So they became widely popular by word of mouth, which meant people were not only keying into her melodrama and her heroics and the sexiness of her characters and her romance plots, but there was something even about this kind of didacticism that really also created believers out of people. So they became, the novels worked, worked maybe like Gone with the Wind or Uncle Tom's Cabin, that they functioned ideologically and polemically even more than they did as a kind of novel, right? They circulated. Those long speeches, which I just don't see how anybody reads them, they recruited people into a belief system so that when you read the novel, you not only participated imaginatively in the romance plot, but you were also recruited in the middle of your romance plot, you were recruited into a belief system. And that was fairly effective. I mean, it was the books, the 1,000-page novels became massively, massively popular. And their sales spike every now and then, like right at 2008, after the crash, those sales spiked way up again. And all the Tea Party rallies, people had those signs that said, "Who is John Galt?" which is the hero from Atlas Shrugged. So, decade after decade, this like new recruits huge sales for what appeared to be almost unreadable novels that are read, and people memorize them and know lines from them and, can circulate the sayings and characters from them.
Who is John Galt? Now you can Google it.
Who is John Galt?
Now it's now Googleable. This dynamic between critical hatred on the one hand and popular success on the other reminds me a lot of Donald Trump.
Yeah.
How did that combination of factors of sort of like the professional appraisal being so negative and the popular one being so effusive, how did that shape her own thinking and also maybe her appeal? Did people did people like that about her, that she was getting hated by book critics?
Yes. And I mean, in part, that was a source of popularity, that she was being hated by cultural elites. So that's a similarity to the Trump situation. But we're still all trying to explain, right, why Donald Trump is as popular as he is, why he gets the votes that he gets. And many of your podcasts are involved with attempts to explain that. It's not obvious on its surface, right, why so many people would find Donald Trump to be an appealing political representative. So it requires a pretty deep dive. Well, the same with Ayn Rand, right, in that it's very difficult to understand on the surface what the appeal of these novels is. So that was one of my questions. I mean, when I started with the book, I really two questions. One is, how is someone who was really formed in the early and mid 20th century become a huge icon in the 21st century when she's really out of time? It's anachronistic. She doesn't fit. She's not a neoliberal figure. She doesn't fit. And how can someone who's so unreadable be so massively and continuously popular? Those are the two questions. The first question was easier to answer because that's where I think the greed and the cruelty and the vision of raw capitalism is a motor of neoliberal affect and neoliberal consent, so that she's taken up as someone who reviles the moochers and adores the successes, the entrepreneurs. As the massive popularity, just like with Donald Trump, is harder to understand. So I can really only speculate, and my speculation in this book is that she mobilizes very deeply resonant cultural narratives, right, about race and gender and sexuality and creativity and achievement that are deeply embedded in the history of colonialism, settler colonialism, and the rise of capitalism, that are core aspects of how we understand how the world works, that come from empire and colonialism. And she has done a really amazing job of embedding those narratives so that they speak deeply to people's kind of unconscious, their fantasies, their memories, and that they resonate to them, in a sense, in defiance of the political pressures and critiques that come from the other direction. Right. So, if you feel like, yes, and you can't say it in your high school class, white people really are superior. That's why we're in charge everywhere. Why do white people have all the goodies? Because we're better. You can get that validated in an Ayn Rand novel without having it said explicitly, right? If you can say, if it gives you a rationale to not give a shit, to not have any compassion, to not have any solidarity, and if that's your sort of desired set of, it can put your psyche together around that and make it okay, legitimate it.
That brings to mind what I was watching her 1967 appearance with Johnny Carson on the Tonight Show, where she celebrated capitalism but denounced the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
And in terms of people reading it and getting these affirmations for what are pretty horrifying ideas, is something basic to her appeal, do you think, the allure of her transgression, her deviance?
Definitely. I mean, it's like, the kind of thrill the alt-right, if you read alt-right stuff, the kind of thrill that someone like Milos, gets from saying exactly what he knows is going to piss everyone off. And that appeals, that has a kind of appeal to it. She had that kind of appeal, right? To say the thing that pissed everyone off. So that even when she was being an atheist and saying there should be no drug laws and advocating abortion, which were not positions the right wing was organizing around, her iconoclasm, her look you dead in the eye and say the thing that's going to piss you off, has a kind of appeal that is similar to, say, that one's mobilized by figures on the alt-right that kind of do that deliberate provocativeness. She had the deliberate provocativeness. She loved to speak to college audiences and just, set their hair on fire. Just say things, outrageous things, and things that combine things that they didn't think went together. And to do it with this sort of, with her cigarette holder and her dollar bill gold pen, her dollar sign gold pen, and, and pronounce in this way that she was like a character. She was a character in her own fiction.
I'm Naomi Klein. You're listening to The Dig, as well you should be, and you can support them on patreon.com.
This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com/thedig, and by Verso Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is Our History is the Future, Standing Rock versus the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Long Tradition of Indigenous Resistance by Nick Estes. In 2016, a small protest encampment at the Standing Rock Reservation in North Dakota, initially established to block construction of the Dakota Access Oil Pipeline, grew to be the largest indigenous protest movement in the 21st century. Water protectors knew this battle for native sovereignty had already been fought many times before, and that, even after the encampment was gone, their anti-colonial struggle would continue. In Our History is the Future, Nick Estes traces traditions of indigenous resistance that led to the No DAPL movement. Our History is the Future is at once a work of history, a manifesto, and an intergenerational story of resistance. I recently did a really incredible, in-depth, lengthy interview with Nick as well. You can find it at thedigradio.com. You should also really buy and read the book. Our History is the Future, Standing Rock versus the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Long History of Indigenous Resistance by Nick Estes. Out now from Verso Books. Rand, of course, is definitionally an elitist, as we've discussed.
Yes.
But the culture that she embraced and purveyed is, in fact, middlebrow and popular, like
Yes.
the movies.
Yes.
She loves surfaces.
Yes.
And so does Trump, as your book reminded me of an essay Corey Robin
Yeah.
wrote along these lines, where he writes, quote, he's talking about Trump's obsession, the way he gets almost emotional talking about selecting types of marble. And he writes, quote, Trump seems to be sincerely moved by the surface of things. The surfaces are garish and gauche, but you sense some kind of inner stirring in him when he writes about those surfaces, a stirring you otherwise never feel. What do you make of this dedicated superficiality on the one hand?
Yeah, it's a funny
and the celebration of
combination.
elitism, but embodiment of middlebrowism on the other.
Yeah, I mean, all of her tastes were middlebrow. Her own preferences in music and literature. Her favorite television show at the end of her life was Charlie's Angels. She loved it. She had a real pop culture middlebrow. She didn't like European high culture. Even though she identified with a kind of superior elite, creative elite, and with Bauhaus, right, particularly like her architecture fantasies in the Fountainhead. But most of her own sort of tastes were very middlebrow. And it's a funny combination because on the one hand, she's like Liberace, right? And that's like Trump. If you think of Trump like Liberace, right? With the gold and the marble and the capes and and it's just her obvious pleasure, right, in those things, or his, Liberace's or Trump's. There's something about that kind of has a celebrity sort of resonance, but it's combined with such a hard-edged, unempathic, anti-solidaristic politics that's Trumpian. It's not Liberacean, but that combination of a sort of appeal to popular tastes while advocating the complete victory by the wealthiest, right, and everything to the wealthy. But it's not it's a hierarchy of wealth, but not a hierarchy of taste. So the hierarchy of taste is reviled as the cultural elite, but the hierarchy of wealth is the donors to the party, right? So it's that combination of populist taste and advocacy of radical inequality of wealth.
But then it was the other way around in her own critique of Hollywood, where she thought the hierarchy of wealth was tarnishing the hierarchy of taste.
Well, I mean, she just thought that people weren't letting her do what she wanted to do, right? And she was such a thorn in King Vidar's side on the set of the Fountainhead because she wanted to control all the speeches and so forth. So her idea of what was quality I mean, it made the film fail, at which point she became very angry and blamed them when she's the one who made it as boring as it was. So she thought that and it's actually not wealth per se, she thought the business culture ruined Hollywood by not allowing the creative individual, her, to impose her middlebrow taste on the popular movies. So the contradictions there are so legion, right? It doesn't ultimately add up and make any sense because it's driven, the sole logic is the logic of narcissism.
Because on the one hand, capitalist morality is fundamentally about blaming people's condition on the choices failing people have made. But when Rand doesn't get exactly what she wants in Hollywood, she immediately blames the kind of inferiority of actually existing American capitalism for all of her own career troubles.
For not being really capitalist, right? Everybody fails her and disappoints her because they don't live up to her superior values, which are never questioned. It's the logic of narcissism, and there's no other logic. And there's no other consistency in the way that these contradictory positions hang together in terms of her relationship to Hollywood and so forth. Her reactions were just based on a narcissistic vision of what should happen. And that's not diagnostic. I mean, it's and to the extent that she's a sociopath, to the sense that she's a malignant narcissist, that's what capitalism is. Right? I mean, that she's reflecting the history of empire, colonialism, and capitalism as being narcissistic and sociopathic. So it's not her individual diagnosis. It's the logic of narcissism and the logic of sociopathy underpin how Wall Street operates.
Yeah, that an ideologue of capitalism is full of contradictions should not be surprising.
It's not rational. It's not like, the fantasy of pure neoliberal or capitalist rationality. It's not rationality. It's hung together by a logic of narcissism and sociopathy. A lot of the decision making on the actually exist in Wall Street, right? Rather than driven by pure rational self-interest as the ideological proponents would have it.
There's something really Nixonian here, too.
Yes.
This middle-brow elitist revanchism, this deep hostility to, which we also see in Trump, to the actually existing elite, or at least a portion of that actually existing elite.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that's so on point because I hadn't thought of it that way, but now that you say it, she's so Nixonian. Her fate is Nixonian, right? Her hubris is Nixonian. Her fate is Nixonian. Her view of herself versus the other's view of her, her view of the world versus how the world works. It's she's very Nixonian in her. As a character in her own drama, she's a Nixonian character. It's tragic. And it's predictably tragic from the start.
Neoliberal luminary Ludwig von Mises wrote to Rand in 1958, quote, "You have the courage to tell the masses what no politician told them. You are inferior, and all the improvements in your conditions, which you simply take for granted, you owe to the effort of men who are better than you." How does Rand's style of elitism get translated into extreme elitism, get translated into mass populist politics that appeal to people who are definitionally the presumptive
masses,
losers and masses? Because why in Rand's thinking are the masses supposed to accept rule by an elite that so openly disdains them? Does she believe in an ideal where the rabble can be good by recognizing their superior's superiority and thus creating a harmonious social whole? Or is her vision more fatalistically tragic, a world that will always be bad because the masses will never quietly accept rule by their superiors?
Yeah, that's another really, really excellent question, because the question for our time, right, is how do people become recruited to a social order and identify desires, fantasies, and aspirations with the social order that is crushing them, right? And that's what makes Lauren Berlant's idea of cruel optimism so brilliant, is she's trying to explain that in a way that isn't a false consciousness. The answer isn't just false consciousness and we go home. It's like...
Or video games.
Or video games, right? It's like to try to answer that question. And that's so the popularity of Ayn Rand raises that same question in a different frame, the way you laid it out. She's saying, quite as the quote says, that the masses of people are inferior, and the only way to social success is to recognize superiority and have rule by the superior. And yet the people who are buying her books and being recruited into this would overwhelmingly be among the inferior masses. But they don't see themselves that way. Because her version of individualism and aspirational individualism allows them to exceptionalize themselves from the masses and make an identification aspirationally with the sexy, entrepreneurial, that they, like the millionaire, like the billion, they have a chance and to be that. And if they were to accept solidarity with the mass losers, they would be sacrificing their chance, right, to rise out by their own efforts. As long as people can sort of invest in the idea that a set of identifications that allows them to exceptionalize themselves, that's the only way Ayn Rand's work can be popular.
So identifying with the heroes of Rand's fiction requires a sort of cruel optimism, or else within the logic of the book, you're a irredeemably brute, primitive loser person.
Right. And you have to the way out of that, if you're a fan of the book, the only way out of that is self-exceptionalizing. So the little bit different than that in Cruel Optimism is that in Cruel Optimism, Berlant is really talking about a kind of ordinariness of the good life. Like, I'll do this job until someone offers me a permanent one. I'll go to grad school and I'll try really hard and maybe I'll be the one who gets a job. Whereas Ayn Rand, it's so much more adolescent. I mean, Berlant's version of Cruel Optimism is a very adult thing, right? It's not like the life of a 17-year-old isn't to see themselves that way. But Rand's fiction appeals more to this adolescent idea of dramatic, right? It's dramatic. I will aspire to climb the mountain, and I will become, right? It's a fantasy of having sex and being gorgeous and making it, right? And that's very adolescent, right? Yeah, being sexy and successful, and like that's what's going to happen to me if I just believe, right? I mean, that's all self-help culture, right? Is telling you to do. That's offered instead of an identification with the plight of all the people who are not going to make it, right, in those terms.
But maybe, at least in some repressed or subliminal way, I'm never on really firm ground when I go into Freudian territory, but they're both maybe operating at the same time for many readers.
Yes.
And there seems to be something there about the erotics of domination and the sadomasochistic, both narratives and politics that you identify in Rand that seem to be at play. And that immediately brought to mind that recent incredible moment when Trump mocked one of his supporters for being obese after he mistakenly thought that the supporter was a protester, and the guy was totally fine with it. And there's almost this eagerness to take punishment from Daddy Trump.
Yeah,
that
then
was
you
really
just have
weird.
to go right into the authoritarian personality part of this, right? Because there are very many pieces of trying to understand, right, support for this social order, and support for competitive capitalism and support for sort of the daddy authoritarian are not necessarily the same thing, but they're being merged, right? And they have been historically merged often, and they are being merged. And I do think that in part, I'm also not someone who is does psychoanalytic readings, but I think in the end that's the way to go with this, which is why a lot of what Richard Seymour writes really appeals to me, right? Talking about the capitalist death drive.
Me too.
Because you have to explain irrationality. You have to in some way illuminate the irrationality of it, rather than, as so many leftists do, understandably, search for the rationality of it. There's often a search for the rationality. Why, on rational terms, would these people vote for Trump, rather than illuminating the irrationality of it, right? So, and the psychoanalysis is particularly an excellent resource for trying to think about that. So my work isn't psychoanalytic, but it's gesturing in that direction, and by saying that fantasy, libido, and desire are at the heart of the survival of neoliberal capitalism. And we have to understand what those fantasies and desires are, what the libido is of the identifications, in order to have some sense of how the thing is continuing to operate. And I think that's Richard Seymour is right, and you're raising it here too, that right now a big part of that is masochism and the death drive. And you sort of, you see that when Ayn Rand's crush on the killer, the kidnapper
Hickman.
killer, Hickman, her crush on him, it came at a moment in her life when she was losing work in Hollywood because the talkies, and she was not a native. She could speak English, but it wasn't her first language. She wasn't yet a very accomplished English speaker, so it was affecting her ability to make a living, and she became incredibly angry and depressed and self-hating, right, for a while, like that she wasn't going to succeed and she wasn't going to be able to make it, and that's when she identifies with this killer, right? So the kind of masochistic sadism, the sort of rage, murder, you can see the formation of that. And then her crush on the serial killer, it becomes a template for all her heroes. Her descriptions in her journal of Hickman, right, of his contemptuous snarl, of the way his eyes looked, of the way he stood in court, about how he was a bad boy, and she couldn't help but sympathize with him, and all of her crush stuff on him. The very same language and images recur when she's creating these future heroes. First, Danny Renahan in The Little Street, but then Howard Rourke and John Galt and Hank Rearden have those things too. The way you know they're heroes is because they have the contemptuous snarl and they didn't care what other people think, right? And it comes from a moment in Ayn Rand's own life of maximum abjection. That's when she produces the most extreme version of her sadistic hero, is at a moment of her own objection. So that's the marriage between masochism and sadism, and the projection outward of rage and self-rejection and putting oneself into this killer category at the moment of maximum objection. I mean, this is what people are trying to figure out when they write about school shooters, right? The marriage of those things. And again, I'm not a psychoanalytic writer, but I'm interested in what psychoanalytic writers have to say. And I think Ayn Rand is very, identifications with and fandom of Ayn
ripe
Rand
for such analysis.
Yeah, totally yes. Totally yes.
One thing I wanted to talk about earlier when we were talking about this kind of bedrock civilizational ideology that shaped Rand's worldview is that it very much had to do with her view of the relationship between capitalism and technology. And you write that her 1938 futuristic novella, Anthem, may have been influenced by Evgeny Samatyan's dystopia, We. But you write that a major distinction is that whereas We is high-tech, Rand's dystopia is always enforced primitivism. Because for her, you write, quote, only individualist capitalism can support innovation and progress. Similarly, in Atlas Shrugged, capitalists going on strike forces society back into a state of nature. Why was technology so central to Rand's vision? And then why, in turn, have technologists become amongst her most fervent fans?
Yeah, well, so she, again, this is contradictory, as so much is in Ayn Rand. So she did worship technology in the sense that individual inventors. So in Anthem, it's this that's run by this socialistic government that's clearly based on the Bolsheviks. That no one's allowed to use the word I; everyone has to use we, and technology is forbidden because this one person who has invented the light bulb, they try to squash that because it will imperil the livelihoods of the candle makers. And, the thing about Ayn Rand, too, is she's funny. She can be funny, as well as didactic and boring. She can be really funny. And Anthem is funny. But the guy who invents the light bulb is her hero. So, and in Atlas Shrugged, the guy who invents this magical motor that runs without fuel and that, is also the hero, is the hero of Atlas Shrugged. So technology and the ability to innovate is central to her, and she sees the superiority of the West over the indigenous populations as being related to technology. However, because of her individualism, her vision is on the individual inventor, and she doesn't produce the sort of technological utopia that people who imagine a kind of mass collective technological society do. Galt's Gulch is hilarious in its anachronisms. So here's the utopia of the entrepreneurial inventors, entrepreneurs, and it's like an old West town, right? That's been reinvented. It's very low tech, but each piece of tech there has an individual inventor, right? So there's an individual inventor who runs the mill that does grinds the corn or whatever, but everybody dresses like it's a Wild West town, and it's a very simple, it's like the ideal of the individualist American West married to this kind of idealization of the inventor. So they don't go together very well, but that's what Galt's Gulch is. And then
everyone in the Wild West town, each inventor has their own sort of like science fair set up in the book to sort of show off their project.
Thing that they invented, and each one of them has something that's their thing that they invented, but it's all in this individual kind of frame, in this framework of simplicity. So it's a romance of individual achievement that then can't imagine capitalist technology, right? Like that this is a class project and it's a massive collective investment and it's a corporate undertaking, and
that technology is a social relation.
The reason it appeals to the Silicon Valley guys is because that's how they see themselves. They see themselves as individual entrepreneurs who have innovated this startup or this platform or this, and that they should be left alone by the government. They should not have to meet labor standards. They should not have to. The people who work for them are just, the ants that put the phones together, not the geniuses who invent the phones. It's their vision of themselves aligns pretty tightly with Ayn Rand's view of the individual, not the world they actually live in, which requires a collective class project of investment, but their vision of themselves as the individual producer to whom all value should accrue without interference, that aligns very much with an Ayn Rand fantasy.
So all these techno-libertarians love Rand, but Rand hated libertarians. In the 70s, she called them right-wing hippies.
Yeah.
And she said or wrote, quote, "If such hippies hope to make me their Marcuse, it will not work." Which is really funny, actually.
Yeah.
But it did work.
Yes, they did make her their Marcuse.
And she couldn't stop them.
Yeah.
What happened?
Yeah. Well, so she at the moment that she was developing her distaste for libertarians, it was the moment when the Libertarian Party in the 70s sort of came into existence, which had many, many, many different wings. But there was a countercultural wing of the Libertarian Party. I mean, there still is. A lot of the people who she met, who were vocal and so forth, were countercultural in some way. They were like anarcho-libertarians too, as well as the kind of business libertarians. She had a longer history with the business libertarians. But these new libertarians of the 1970s in the libertarian movement, she didn't like them at all. She reviled them. She made fun of them. They tried to claim her. She hated them. She made, she wrote about them relentlessly, ridiculing them. Hey, some of it is pretty funny. But time has gone by. If you brought Ayn Rand back into the world now, I think she would quite highly approve of the Koch version of libertarianism. That would match her view of libertarianism, not the kind of countercultural, anarcho-capitalist libertarian of the movement that she saw as too countercultural in the 1970s. But, she didn't have the analytic ability to actually see all the different strands. She just had these emotional reactions to phenomena that she then spouted off about. And her sources were always like either anecdotal people she met, or she read Time magazine, or she watched TV. So she formed her political opinions based on the most superficial information about any group of people, any public event, and anything.
And she didn't like hippies
She hated
either,
hippies.
even though she was a libertine of sorts, right?
Well,
or is that not the right terminology for her?
Yeah, libertine, no, but she was non-monogamist. So she
non-ethically non-monogamous, unethically non-monogamous.
Unethical non-monogamous. Well, it started out more ethical in that it was ethical, but it was coercively ethical. She and her lover, Nathaniel Brandon, negotiated with their spouses to allow this affair to occur. So they got permission to have sex once a week, for a couple of hours while her husband left the apartment. So it was all negotiated.
I'm sure her negotiation with her
couples.
husband was very egalitarian, give and take.
Yeah, she was very upset because he apparently didn't really like to have sex with her. I mean, So,
Shocked.
at least, he wasn't sufficiently dominating in the bedroom. So it was ethical in that superficial way, but it was coerced. The consent was coerced consent. Their spouses didn't have any choice, much of a choice, given that they were economically dependent on Nathaniel and Ayn. Both of the spouses were. And then what makes it also veer into the unethical, aside from the coercive nature of the consent, was that she kept it a secret. So a very deep secret. She didn't want anyone in her circle or her movement to know. So here's this proponent of truth and honesty, and she has this deep secret that doesn't get exposed until the 80s, when Nathaniel Brandon's wife wrote a book called The Passion of Ayn Rand, after Rand has died, to talk about this affair. And when the affair broke up, because Nathaniel had yet another secret girlfriend, and Ayn Rand felt that was a violation of morality, decency, and everything valuable, that he had lied to her about his sex life with a less valuable woman.
Because that violates her narrative ideal of these weird sex triangles that are in all of her books, and the woman has to choose the better man of the two. And he chose the inferior woman over Rand, who's obviously the superior one.
And
that's a problem.
Obvious.
That reflects poorly on him.
Exactly. And in fact, it because he was her chosen successor, as the head cult leader, the fact that he had done this violated her entire philosophical system by choosing a lesser value, as well as lying about it. It meant to her that her whole philosophical system was attacked and demeaned, and she never recovered from that. She had a total meltdown. She never recovered from it. She threw him out of Objectivism. She denounced him to everyone. She never admitted the reasons for it. She claimed it was financial fraud. That was a lie. There was no financial fraud. She made everybody choose sides, right? She had him shunned, and he went to California with the new girlfriend and became the founder of what became known as the self-esteem movement.
Wow.
Yeah, so he became a rich
LA
therapist writer and on self-esteem.
Kind of new agey huckster.
Yes, that's what he became. And she had a meltdown. But yeah, so she had an unconventional arrangement that was full of contradictions and unethical practices, as well as the surface ethics. But she wasn't an advocate of do what you want in any way. And she hated the counterculture. She wrote a book called it's about the return of the primitives, which is basically about environmentalists and hippies. And she saw them as wanting to take things back to the dominant of the savages. So, right, in other words,
Connecting back to this technology discussion we were just having.
To roll back Western civilization to the age of the Asian, African, and native hordes. Right, that's what environmentalists wanted, to turn us back to the primitivism and savagery of the hordes of color in the third world, and that if they succeeded, that's what would happen. Western civilization would be destroyed, and all the values that she held dear would be destroyed. So she was a particular attacker of the environmentalism and environmental politics.
Because she saw that as a fundamental threat to capitalism and technology.
Yes, but to capitalism, but also to Western civilization. So to the Western civilization version, the way that capitalism embedded in the values of Western civilization.
It required the domination of nature.
Yeah, yes.
And not caring about it and indifference to it.
The structures of domination and the relation of domination to the natural world, which includes the colored populations, right?
The people who, and this is a
are
very old idea. I was just talking to
world.
Sylvia Federici the other day.
Yeah.
Who are they're associated. Those who are to be dominated are associated with nature.
Yes, and they should be exploitable. The earth and the inferior others are exploitable resources. And if we say we can't exploit the earth, and that means we can't exploit the natural resources of this labor pool, then the entire structure will come down. And she wasn't wrong about that. She was just wrong about hating it.
Right. You write that the practical implementation of Randian thinking, and maybe its overall trajectory as well, can best be understood by looking at the career of her most famous disciple, Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan.
Yes.
How was it that a central core objectivist ideologue became a state manager of monetary policy? Randian anarcho-capitalism, or I don't know if that term she would use, but being put into practice in the service of literally the direct government construction of markets and the economy for capital.
And then
the hand is visible.
And then he took the power of the central banker. She was opposed to central banking, period, but he understood that you needed the power of the state to restructure, to deregulate in the favor of business. So in order to act in favor of the wealthy and in favor of business, you needed the state regulatory power to structure markets and state policy to facilitate redistribution upward.
For Rand, the hand of the state was invisible, but for him, he was like, no, I see the state there.
He actually understood how things work.
Yeah.
Whereas Rand just thought everything should be distributed upward, but she had no comprehension of how that would happen other than her advocating it in a novel. Whereas he understood that you needed the power of the state to regulate markets in order to regulate the legal structure and the market structure in order to facilitate an upward redistribution of resources. So that's what he did. He became the primary architect of financial deregulation from the position of a regulator. He was the regulator who deregulated in the interest of, deregulated is really re-regulated, right, in the interest of upward redistribution. And then, of course, the whole thing fell of its own weight because even with his understanding being superior to hers, he still did not have an understanding that if you redistribute all these resources upward into empowered and unsupervised hands, that havoc will result and the whole thing will collapse. He didn't foresee that at all. So that scene of him testifying where, that I found a flaw, like there's Alan Greenspan, I found a flaw, right, in his own theory. Yeah, well, his own theory was, flawed at its core.
Yeah, somewhat of an understatement.
Yeah, I know. There's a certain hilarity to it, a bitter hilarity to him saying, I found a flaw right after the 2008, subprime mortgage collapse.
Oops.
But he's a very Randian figure in that he was in her inner circle. He was not just a member of the Objectivist cult. He was one of the 5 or 6 people closest to her. Over a long period of time, she and her her husband, her very glamorous, well-dressed husband, were there at Alan Greenspan's induction, confirmation as a member of the Council of Economic Advisors in the Ford administration. So that was the beginning of his trajectory up to become, up to the Fed, joining the Federal Reserve. She's there in the photo, right? She and Frank are President Ford, Alan Greenspan, Ayn Rand, Frank O'Hara. It's a photo of his confirmation. So they were very close. And in his memoir, autobiography, it's really so weird because he credits her with humanizing him. He said, he came in and he was just all about the numbers, all about the numbers, all about the numbers. And he just wanted to line up the data and figure out how the data worked. And she called him the Undertaker. That was her nickname for him because his demeanor was so
a little
grim.
dour.
Yeah. So, but he said that she taught him to think about the larger world.
Wow.
Yeah, and to think about how this worked in the larger world and to think about morality in relation to politics. Now, the morality was to redistribute resources upward. That was the moral action. So from her, he learned that it's not just a neutral managerial task to be an economist. You have to politically engage in order to do the moral thing, which is to redistribute resources upward, which is what he did.
Which was a core irony and contradiction that to achieve Rand's moral aims required active and fundamental state intervention.
Yes, but she didn't realize that. But he did. Yeah. She didn't realize that, but he did.
To close out, as you mentioned earlier, while Trump is a perfect distillation of Rand's mood, as a person and a figure, he is, you write, quote, in most ways a Rand villain.
Yes.
A businessman who relies on cronyism and manipulation of government, who advocates interferences in so-called free markets, who bullies big companies to do his bidding, who doesn't read. His personal and public corruption mirror her character sketches of sellouts and dirtbags. What does it reveal about Rand's enormous influence that the ultimate product of her politics uncannily represents precisely what she so ardently claimed to hate?
Yeah. It's really has to do, it makes the point for me about the investment in her is about the affect. It's about the feeling. It's not about the ideas, right? Her ideas are cartoonish and some people do become fans of her ideas, but it's the feeling attached to the ideas that superior is better and failures are losers, and it's that whole contempt, dismissal, indifference, that's the influence, because that's what Trump has, right? And that's his identification with Howard Rourke, is of the sexy guy, the Aryan-looking sexy guy. He doesn't look like an Aryan-looking sexy guy, but he thinks he does. He wants to. The hair, the whole thing. He's this sexy guy who has.
He was the best baseball player in New York at some point. He said,
yeah. The contempt, the indifference, the assumption of superiority. Those are all very, very Randian. But his actual practices make him a Rand villain, and she would be merciless about him if she were alive. It would be entertaining how merciless she would be about him, from the way he looks in his tennis outfit to every crummy self-dealing government state thing that he does. He would be a cartoon villain for her, but he imagines himself to be an Ayn Rand hero, and that's the power of her vision. Is that there are such a wide swath of people with overlapping and sometimes conflicting political views and policy views who can imagine themselves into her scenarios. And the end result of that is primarily this affective, cruel, greedy meanness that is the takeaway from bonding with an Ayn Rand novel.
Well, Lisa Duggan, thank you so much.
Thanks. Thank you.
Lisa Duggan is a historian, journalist, and activist who teaches at NYU, and the author amongst other things, of Mean Girl, Ayn Rand, and the Culture of Greed. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that money then appears as this distorting power, both against the individual and against the bonds of society, etc., which claim to be entities in themselves. It transforms fidelity into infidelity, love into hate, hate into love, virtue into vice, vice into virtue, servant into master, master into servant, idiocy into intelligence, and intelligence into idiocy. While other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We are posting new episodes every week. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis, music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our communications coordinators are Julia Rock and Zachary Nin. Our senior advisor is Thea Riofrancos. Check out our vast archives at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter at thedigradio, and please find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe. If it's on iTunes or wherever, please leave us a nice review. Those reviews, I think, help introduce us to new listeners. What really does that, though, is you telling your friends about the show. Please make propaganda for us. And do find us at patreon.com/thedig and make a monthly contribution to keep this operation going strong. Even a few bucks is a big help.